So please let me introduce to you our, like I said, distinguished guest. So let's start from here, Mr. Alexander Ač from the Global Change Research Center of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and Mr. Jeffrey Labovitz, Regional Director from Regional Office, IOM Office, covering 10 countries of East Africa and Horn of Africa region. So we have climate specialists here, we have migration specialists here. We will be certainly talking about the nexus of climate changes to migration, mainly forced migration. And maybe we can start with the first question. Do you have any reflections on the film that we have just seen? There are a few.
Hello everybody, thank you for visiting this event, this discussion. Apart that the movie was excellent, I think, very nicely done. I would maybe point out 3 things that came to my mind watching the movie, and these are sea level rise, then migration, and then technology. So at the beginning there was this estimation of 0.6 to 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of this century. Well, actually, currently the best estimation is that the lowest limit of sea level rise is probably 1 meter, and the upper limit is not yet known. So it might be 2 meters or even more under the worst case scenario. So the science progresses in the wrong way as we learn with the impact of climate change. Then migration, I think it was very good shown there that nobody wants to go away from his home, and if people leave the home, it's usually forced or almost always forced. So when we talk about, for instance, in our country or in Europe or anywhere else about migrants or refugees or whatever we call them, we just rationalize our aversion to accept them elsewhere. So we kind of so that was what the movie was about, that we are not really ready to accept these people because anyway it's inevitable. And then the technology, there was this part about the floating city, or I don't know what was it, tower. I think technology is not the solution. Actually, we have all the technologies already. We just don't use them in a sustainable way. So there are limits to technology, and at some point we run out of energy and resources, as was pointed out by the president. So that these were these 3 things, and of course many others. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, in the meantime, welcome our third guest, Ms. Kanta Komari from the World Bank headquarters in Washington. Welcome. Do you have any reflections on the film?
Thank you for inviting me here. I actually have met President Tong. He was at the UN Environmental Assembly where we were on the same panel. And I'm so happy you all had a chance to get to know him. He's a great man. He's a great advocate for global warming. And when you meet him, he's so humble, and it's just striking. And he says, when you meet him in person, it's very much the same as the movie, that my island's gone. There's nothing I can do about it. I learned today in your seminar from one of the speakers that the global warming, which is happening now, was actually created by emissions from our parents from 50 years ago. And so if that's the case, imagine how much it's changed and how much has gotten worse over the last 50 years. And you put that into perspective for him and his island. So my first impression is just having met him, what a great man he is, and his message. He continues to travel around and to share the message, and he's a great global emissary and a voice of conscience for us all. And another issue which struck me in watching it is he talked about, think of the people, and Kiribati is an island of 100,000 people. I was the Director General's envoy to the drought in the Horn of Africa in 2011, 2012. And of course, we just had another one just finished this year, 5 consecutive years of no rain. And 250,000 people died in the 2011, 2012. And over the past 5 years, it keeps getting worse. There's so many people displaced. 1.5 million to 1.8 million people lost their homes in my region from the last drought. And we would talk about it. I remember speaking to a friend of mine who's the deputy regional head of the World Food Program. And he said, we can't talk about drought anymore. We need to talk about changing weather patterns. And this is the new norm and how we adjust to it. And so President Tong is talking about resiliency and building in strategies. And so we need to talk about strategies. And I feel that since this movie was made, we've gone backwards in so many different ways, with my country pulling out of the Paris climate resolutions. And we have a lot of work to do. When we put it into perspective and people who are affected, then it's something which we have to consider really deeply.
Thank you. Kanta, maybe we can move further to your work, because it really covers and it puts some science behind our feelings and our experience so far with climate change. The World Bank earlier this year published a report that talks about exactly what we are talking about now, climate change and its impact or its nexus to forced migration and to human development. What were the main findings? What did you find out through the report and work on it?
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share with some of the work. And I think a real starting point for the work that we did in putting out this report, which was Groundswell Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, really stems from the story in this documentary. It's really a realization that, the nexus of climate migration and development needs to be understood. I think one of the things that President Tong said that I just want to start off my presentation is that what's happening to them today is going to happen to the rest of the world tomorrow if we do nothing. And I think that's one of the reasons that what the report that Susanna refers to is a robust analytical piece of work that the World Bank did to really understand, based on this kind of stories and situations and anecdotes that keep repeating itself, what is really going to be that scale of climate-induced migration between now and moving forward. So looking backwards and understanding where we are using the science, but really providing a forward look at that scale and magnitude. So what we did was really to apply a state-of-the-art data sets and analytics to get an understanding of that scale. And we did this for 3 regions of the world. We did it for Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Very quickly to share with you the 3 top findings. The first is that within these 3 regions, we would have, by 2050, 143 climate-induced migrants as a consequence just simply from slow onset climate change. One of the factors being sea level rise that we heard a lot about, complemented with storm surges. The second factor being crop productivity losses, when people can't carve out a livelihood and they would move. And the third being just water stress that Jeff referred to, recurrent droughts and not ability to have sufficient water. So with these 3 factors being the drivers, you get that scale. The second message beyond the sort of general big number is that it's differentiated in different parts of the world. And it is really the poorest areas that will be the most hit. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, we would have up to 87 million, going down to 40 million in South Asia and about 17 million. These are based on scenarios. These are not predictions. They are scenarios that suggest that if we don't act concretely now, both on the climate and development action, then these numbers could pan out. But the third the dynamic that I wanted to talk about beyond the scale and the scale at region is that this is an unfolding phenomena. So what you saw in the documentary is how it has unfolded in Kiribati. And in the work that we did, we showed that between 2020 and 2050, the numbers will keep ramping. This is not a problem for tomorrow. The problem has already started. But if we don't address it, then those numbers will trajectory begins to go up. And we only did the analysis till 2050, but the numbers would get much worse. The last thing that I would say here that we looked at was the spatial dimension. Not every place is the same. I think Jeff just talked about in the Horn of Africa where you have these recurrent droughts. So you have some geographies that are more impacted by climate change, and people there will not be able to sustain certain types of livelihoods and will be induced to move if we don't give them the right support, A, to have a better livelihood within the means that they can, 2, if they need to move, and how do we enable that mobility to happen in a dignified way. But the third is really to close the loop between the receiving areas and the sending areas to make sure that people hone in together. So let me stop there for now, Susanna, and then we can come back to the discussion.
Okay. Jeff, you already started to explain situation in your region. Like I said, it's covering 10 countries. But when you came, you wanted to talk about goats. Can you elaborate further on that? Why goats?
Let's talk about goats. It's an article I wrote for a newspaper, the East African, in my region. And it was about the drought. Like I said, we had 200,000 plus deaths in 2011 and 12. And that was drought caused, but was also caused by terrorism and Al-Shabaab and access to populations and their inability to get out of their situation. They came across borders and they came to refugee camps. One of them was called Dadaab, another one Dolo Ado. My job was actually to pick people up at the borders and then have medical teams and refer them when they needed help, and then take them to the refugee camps. And then we worked in the refugee camps in various ways. And they're still there today. There's not all of them, but most of them are. Dadaab became the biggest refugee camp in the world, 500,000 people at that time. And like I just said, just now we had in the past, in fact it was in the past year, 1.5 million to 1.8 million people, which we've counted, they're real, who also left because of the drought. It was much better this year, these last few years, because we didn't have the death. They didn't have to go across borders. It wasn't as dangerous, but they were displaced internally. And when they're displaced internally, and we're thinking, and what is their prospects for being displaced? Because their goats have died. So that's why we talk about goats. And we did a lot to sustain people, but we didn't do much to sustain their livelihoods. And goats in my region, it's like your bank account. It's your savings. It's your house. A goat can cost $30 to $50. A cow, $500 to $1,000. These people are earning a couple dollars a day. So imagine that as a bank account in your livelihood and your savings. And I tried to get estimates on livestock which died, 20, 30, 40 million, but it's really hard to get. There's organizations which are dedicated to that, but they couldn't come up with numbers for me. 20%, they said in some locations. But what that means is the drought's over. It rained. It was a huge rain, which you don't want after a drought, because 300,000 more people were displaced because of the flooding. And it washes away the seeds. But the people who had animals, which is a big part of the population, have nothing to go back to. Their savings accounts are gone, and they have no livelihoods. And so when we're looking at assistance strategies, we have to look at the people, and that's first, but we also have to look at their livelihood strategies. And if, in fact, and it is a fact, that we have growth rates which are so substantial that we're going to add 1 billion people to Africa by 2050, and if, in fact, the weather patterns are the new norm, then animal husbandry and subsistence agriculture is not the answer. And so we have to be working at diversification of livelihoods. And there's a massive urbanization process in how we get people jobs and how we give them training. And what happens in drought also, we're not saving the goats, but we're also not doing development programming. And a lot of the money is just going to saving lives. And so the whole resilience frameworks is something which is lacking. And so with that, we have to talk about goats.
By the way, we do have this article printed out for you, and it is available on the tables outside of the room if you're interested in reading it. Alexander, are we in Central Europe, in Slovakia, affected by climate change at all? We can see that the weather changes, but should we worry? Should we be also concerned?
Yeah. So compared to other parts of the world, impacts in Slovakia might seem as a walk in the park, but it will be serious here as well. So maybe let me point out this year we had a not record cold, but relatively cold March. So this was anomaly, and the vegetation was shifted to approximately 10 or up to 2 weeks later. So the vegetation started later. And then we had a record of April, May, and so on up to now. And the vegetation finished 2 weeks sooner. So we basically didn't have spring, and probably we will not have very long autumn either. So this is not typical year, and probably it will not repeat next year, but it's a general pattern that's happening increasingly often. That means that there is this increase in variability of the weather, and we are jumping from low temperatures to extreme hot temperatures, from drought to flood, and so on. So this is very problematic, let's put it mildly, not only for people working in agriculture, which is the basis of the whole civilization, in fact, not only in Slovakia, but it's a problem for everyone else. So we are feeling the impacts of climate change here, and the biggest problem also in Slovakia and elsewhere will be probably the water. That means we have gradual increase in average temperature, apart from the extremes I mentioned. But there is another underlying trend that is increasing temperature increases evaporation from the earth, and we don't have more rain. That means the long-term trend in precipitation is the same as was 100 years ago, but the temperature is not. So we have almost 2 degrees warmer temperature in Slovakia or in Middle Europe as well. That means that if you have the same precipitation, but you have 2 degrees hotter temperature, that means that 200 liters per square meter is missing because it's evaporated more, but the rain is not coming. So we have this long-term drought problem, which is only going to get worse. And this will be one of the most problematic impact to adapt. So there are limits to adaptation as well. It's not possible to adapt to anything. So that's it.
There are some opinions who kind of blame climate change for increased conflicts, certainly for causing forced migration. We are here talking mainly about migration and forced migration. And as we heard throughout our seminar and also in the movie, it is already happening. It's nothing to be stopped. It's happening. What we can do is maybe influence our future in next 2 generations. So my question is now more about migration and people who are affected by it. Statistically, more people are forced to migrate because of climate change than because of conflicts. Yet, they are not covered by any binding convention or anything that would internationally bind countries and states to protect them. So what is actually, maybe Jeff, it's to you or maybe you, what is their legal situation, what is the reality, and what are perhaps possible solutions, at least theoretical, that we could follow and pursue?
I'll let Jeff come back to the legal conversation, but I think where the conversation is really important is to begin, apart from the legal perspective, is to really look at the underlying causes. And I think in some way I touch upon it. I mean, when we see that some of the fundamentals in the environmental and ecological systems are changing as a consequence of climate change, and that really does affect people's livelihoods and ability to deal with the situation, then that's when they're pushed to move. And I think the point is that movement is really sort of a last resort. But I think where the reality is that we can't wait for that situation to happen. I want to come back to a point that I think was made earlier, maybe Jeff made it. we have, situations like you say, conflict is there, climate change impacts are there, and then you have disasters. Right now, I think the way in which the conversations are is a little bit siloed. We have a disaster, and we have the best of the disaster response agencies stepping in. We have a humanitarian crisis and and then you have the development world that also works in silo. And I think these issues are becoming more linked. And if we really want to have durable, sustainable solutions, we need, as communities, a disaster response, humanitarian development, to really come in and work together. And then I think there is the whole conversation on sort of the legal processes and the processes that are underway. Have been engaged a little bit on the Global Compact for migration, at least being part of that conversation. And when we prepared this report on the groundswell and the internal migration, we made a presentation at the negotiation session in New York. But I think where we have the conversation on that is very much looking at the cross-border movement and not looking at movement within countries. And so even as we presented these findings, which will show you that the scale of the issue is going to be ramping up and it's going to become more aggravated, it is not part of the domain of the conversation because they're looking at cross-border. And yet at the same time, I think, which is why I come back to the fact that a lot of this needs to be dealt with the development, humanitarian, disaster communities working within a national context. But clearly, there is need for that global communities and the legal processes to be also worked out. For that, I pass you to Jen.
I think I would say the same thing as you. I'm not a lawyer. The codification...
No, sorry, by legal I meant what would be their status, because it was also in the film that it's nice that we buy land, but what are we there? Are we citizens? If we move, do we have rights? Can we work, etc.? So not legalistically legal, but rather kind of residence permit or...
But ultimately that is very legal. Mm-hmm. There's the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. And that's something which member states, so all the countries in the world and the United Nations, have come together, and it's not a binding legal agreement, but it's a commitment which they commit to. And a part of that has been climate refugees and internally displaced people due to climate change. And there's been a harmonization within the two compacts, which makes reference to those caseloads. There was very strong support from member states that particularly when they cross borders, they're in refugee-like situations and are in need of international protection. And that's certainly something which will continue. And with the global compacts, I think we're on the way to a further codification of the status of people. When they're internally displaced, they have the same rights as any other citizen does in their own country. But they certainly had many, many needs. And in my previous conversation, we talked about, the refugee camps and internally displaced people camps, and they'll be there for years to come until there's solutions for sustainable livelihoods. But that's not a right. It's not codified within national legislation on how that will come. It's reliant upon donors and donors' appeals in those processes. But I think that with the president and his advocacy, we're coming to the stage where there's further discussion, and we're farther along in our thinking in those areas than we ever have been. So on that one, I think there is progress, and certainly from the compacts themselves.
When we are talking about internally displaced people, from international point of view, it might look as less of a problem, but vast majority of them, they find themselves in countries that are not rich. So, and it is an impact, and it is a pressure for the country where certain part of population, very often numerous part of population, is replaced to a different region, and it's difficult for the regions to deal with it. So it may be kind of internal within borders of one country, but still it's an issue, a potential source of conflict or instability, etc. So do we have questions from the audience to our guests? Yes? Here?
Good evening. My name is Tomáš Meravi, and I'm an economist at Mesaten. I've been to Africa recently, to Tanzania, and they're a country of roughly 50 million people, and every year the population is increased by 1.5 million people. as you said, the population of Africa is going to possibly multiply within the upcoming century. Some estimates range from 2.5 billion to 4 billion people. The Middle East is seeing some rather dramatic increase in population, which probably was a contributing factor to the Arab Spring and the civil wars. And if you take the combined effect of climate change and the fact that all these countries are rather poor and the growth in population, then clearly the potential for civil strife and conflict increases. Now, most of the migration from this probably stays within Africa, but part of it comes to Europe. And as you know, it's a contentious political issue in Europe. My question is, are there any forecasts on how migration to Europe as a result of all these factors is going to increase in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question. Yes, there are scenarios about number of people coming to Europe as a result of impacts of climate change. That is, apart from other impacts that will probably get worse in the future. The latest study, I think it was published in Science a few months ago, they calculated that there should be, by the end of the century, coming to Europe about 1 or up to 1 million people per year as a result of climate change, which should be seen as a conservative estimation because probably this will be aggravated by other impacts. Let me give you an example of Syria. The preceded conditions in Syria before the civil war in 2011, they had 4 years drought and about 1.5 million people were internally displaced first as a result of drought. People from villages migrated to cities. This increased the, let's say, tension within the country. And of course, the number of people that escaped the country as a result of the conflict was several times higher than the initially triggered number of migration by climate change. So I would say this estimation of 1 million people per year to Europe is probably the lowest possible estimation by the end of the century, which of course is a problem. And I would like to point out, Jeff said the new normal, or is it used quite often also not only to climate or also to other trends, but the new normal means that there is something which is happening now and it will happen in the future. But the fact is, it's going to get worse until we stabilize CO2 concentration in the air. So actually we have no new normal. We have continuously worsening situation unless the climate is stabilized, and then we have the new normal. That means we will not get the new normal sooner than, let's say, within later in this century.
If we talk about the new norm, so should we think about possible migration induced by all this as a problem, as a challenge, or perhaps as an opportunity? Jeff, what do you think? If it's new norm, if it's not another crisis, if we cannot call it crisis anymore, if we are to prepare for it?
I don't think migration. I think migration is almost a byproduct of a whole bunch of other confluent issues, environment being one, and population growth being another. And it's a coping mechanism. People go and they find work and livelihoods when they don't have the opportunities at home anymore. And if you didn't have coping mechanisms, you'd have a lot of catastrophes. From my region, right now, there's only 5,000 migrants who've arrived in Europe this year. Those are mostly Eritreans, Ethiopians, and Sudanese. It's not a massive number, but there are massive numbers moving around. We think there's 65,000 people moving per month. And that's not considered negative migration. It's considered positive by pretty much everyone. And that doesn't include people who are moving just cross borders. A big coping mechanism is that when people do subsistence agriculture, is they go across borders and they sell it if they can make more money, or maybe they grow something which they can get better prices for, and that's a form of migration, and that's considered positive. When there's conflict, it gets aggravated, and they close borders and they don't have those safety valves, and that causes other problems. And then at times you have refugees, which is a more forced migration phenomena, which is less controlled and less managed, which is not as good. The majority of people are going to work in Saudi Arabia from my region. In Saudi Arabia, there's jobs and they need workers. But they need to do it in a managed way where there's also social protection for the people who are doing it. And I would claim, with complete certitude, that if we didn't have migration, you'd have more forced migration, because if you didn't have people sending home money to their families in Somalia, for example, who are working in large numbers in Saudi Arabia, more people would have to come out because they wouldn't be able to survive. And so there's a critical mass which are able to stabilize countries as a social safety net. And so what it means is there has to be a balance. And we haven't come to that stage yet where we're reaching a balance. We're reacting now to larger numbers arriving in Europe, but we have to come to some sort of thinking where we're not reacting to environmental change, but we're building resilience, and we're not reacting to forced migration or desperate migration, but we're looking at managed migration. So it all comes together.
Well, my question was coming from really very European context, as was already hinted, that it's very often used as an argument that we should do something against it, because then the people would come. They would migrate in large numbers, yet most of the European countries need migrant workers, at least and that's about already managed migration and like you said, the balance. Do we have more questions from the audience, please?
My name is Zuzana Hudekova, and I'm working especially in the climate change adaptation in cities. And I have the following question. It is more concerning the movie. I didn't realize exactly the date when the movie was produced, but I felt at the end a little bit of optimism due to the Paris Agreement. And now we are 3 years after Paris Agreement. We know that the CO2 emissions didn't stop to rise. In practice, even every year there is these UN how to say these meetings?
General Assembly.
General Assembly, but no concrete results. So what should we do as a humanity to stop this negative trend?
Any of you?
It's I hear you, and I think a lot of us who've been following the process feel that sometimes a similar stress, a similar disappointment that nothing is happening. But I think one of the sort of good takeaways, you started your comment with the cities, and I thought you were going to go in that way. And I think that cities are really going to be an important part of a resilient future. I think we know from all the trends and the demographics that more and more people are going to be in cities. And so I think there is a strong move towards this sustainable, resilient cities. There's the ICLE program. And I think these programs are really showing a way on, resilient cities that are green cities, that reduce your carbon footprint, that bring in more renewables. So I think there is something positive happening there. And I was recently twice in New York with the New York Director of Resilience, who's really looking at New York City. And I think the efforts that New York City is putting to the issue of climate change and building resilience is exemplary, and clearly they lead. What New York does, like they say, the rest of the world follows. So cities like New York, after Sandy and other events, have been taking it very, very seriously. So they have really carved out a program which has looked at various scenarios that they have to deal with, and from all the different kinds of impacts, from storms and surges and sea level, but also heat stress, for example, that you mentioned. Interesting fact, in New York City, the director was saying that 600 people die in New York each year from heat stress. And that's more than the number of people killed by gun violence. And that number is only going to go up. But then New York is being very proactive. So, I mean, I think that there are some glimpses of, hope. I think where it is despairing is, I think, to your earlier question, where you have the demographic trends going in a certain direction. You have youth bulges. And we really need to change towards that new normal, almost that new climate normal, which is not a stationary state, which is still dynamic, but recognize that in many cases, a lot of these highly climate sensitive livelihoods cannot be sustained in the way that they are, and that we need to come up with new ways in which to sort of channel diversification of livelihoods or create social safety nets that we talked about in terms of remittances. And there I think that, we haven't sort of got that cohesive thinking to really factor climate much more explicitly, and migration being one of those facets. Because migration is both sort of, has this distress migration, but there's also the positive part of adaptation as migration as an adaptation strategy. But I just want to leave you with the fact that, I think there are glimpses of hopes, and I look at the cities as one example that I think is really positive. And then, of course, we can all do our own bit as individuals that we can probably come back to talk about.
Thank you. I would just try to shortly react to the question, what should be done. So when the Paris Agreement was adopted, there was a lot of optimism among politicians, analysts, economists, and so on. And quite a lot of climatologists were highly skeptical, and the reaction was, what do you want more? This is the best we could have, 200 countries, whatever, and 2 degrees and so on. But the main line of criticism, and I would think economists here would agree, that what needs to be done is to put a price on carbon. Because we have a monetary system, everything is money for us, so at least we should be sincere and if we take climate change impact seriously, we should pay more for using them. If they are cheap, people will use it. I have almost any friends of mine, and I believe any friends of yours, if there is cheap flight to wherever it is, Los Angeles, Australia, they will fly. No matter what they know or what they don't know. Usually they don't know, but even if they know, they would fly because it's cheap and people like to travel. So at least we should make it more expensive for them if they want to destroy the future.
Further questions or maybe comments to what was said?
Good evening. My name is Susanna, and I would be very interested if you have a knowledge on what is the current position of countries like Russia, and why, because we are hearing from different sources about negative impact of climate change, but it is foreseen that in certain territories, like also the Russian ones, will be impacted in the short term, of course, in a positive way. So the land will be more fertile, etc. So whether do you think that the countries as like Russia, etc., will maybe politically exploit this situation regarding climate change? Thank you.
Okay, I can try shortly. Again, very good question. People will exploit everything what they can. And yes, I would say Russia will do it. US is doing it already. Australia is doing it already. Canada probably too. I would doubt that if there is more warming, that Russia will be more fertile. I would say when the permafrost will melt, you will not grow too much food because it will be mud. There will be no tractors driving in melting permafrost. They will be stuck there. So I'm not sure if it will be good for the Russia, but maybe they think so. Again, it comes back to the thing that if it's cheap and if it's profitable, people will do it. Just yesterday I read an article showing or writing that the first commercial ship will sail through northern route in Arctic, the Maersk transport company, because there is no ice and everybody is waiting for more ships coming to Arctic. And they said we will use also some research facilities and some research, which is nice, but I don't think that's the main idea, is doing more research for them. So again, if it's cheap, people will, search for the fossil fuels. We know already we shouldn't search for any new fossil fuels if we want to keep warming less than 2 degrees. So, and we are still doing it. We are investing millions, billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars into searching of new fossil fuels, while we shouldn't extract those we already found. So we are not serious. There should be any fracking at all, be it in USA or it's spreading to UK. Even Russia is starting to adopt new technologies, so they can be able to frack all the other resources. So, and we know we shouldn't be doing that. So unless this is happening, we are not going to solve the problem, no matter how much money is thrown at renewable energies and so on.
Maybe just to add to that, but also coming back to, I think what the point that you raise, I think is one that is in the public domain. I mean, based on the climate science and climate impacts, clearly when we talk about a 2-degree world or a 4-degree world, we're talking about global mean temperatures. And the way that global warming and all of its associated impacts will play out is different in different parts of the geography of the world. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, sea level rise will be more prominent. In sub-Saharan Africa, the drought patterns will be there. In northeast of sub-Saharan Africa, they say there increased precipitation. But in this part of Europe, the science did indicate that the nature of the climate impacts will be slightly less. But that, I think, is sort of in the global context when you look at the warming patterns. But when you begin to look at even the precipitation patterns where one says there is not that much change, it's the change in the seasonality and the distribution. So I think a lot more needs to be done at the local level to understand what it really means. And then I think there was, at least in the science at one time, saying that there are areas of opportunity here which compared to other parts of the world would be more impacted. But translating from global models to regional to local, I think is really important. Just wanted to bring that.
Anything to add? No. Okay. Further question, please.
Good evening. My name is Kamil. I did study climate change law, and I'm former employee of IOM in Slovakia. So my question is regarding status of climate change migrants. As far as I know, and I did some research, and you confirmed it already, they don't have any legal status at the moment, climate change migrants. But I believe it's all depending from political will. And here you said you are a bit skeptical at the time. So do you believe that there's really a will to establish climate change as a cause for giving refugee status to people and, for example, grant asylum? At the moment, we know that political debate around refugees is not very stable, and it's causing a lot of populism here in Europe and in the US. And So my question is there really space for that? And also, how would we establish what exactly is climate change, migration, or things caused by climate change migrations? For example, you mentioned Syria, and people would say it's nothing to do with migration. It's not so easy to establish this is caused by climate change. In Kiribati, it would be probably different. It's a small island, so if it's flooded, it's clearly caused by climate change. But with Syria, Iraq, or many other maybe African nations, it's not so clear. So do you think, is there even a way to establish climate change as a cause for migration, legally?
I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think in a way you've given that answer yourself. I mean, establishing the causality is always a difficult thing, first of all, even if before we go into any legal processes. So even as we talk about someone being a climate migrant, I think what we are saying is that the sort of larger part, aside from islands like Kiribati, the larger part of what has motivated them to move, could have been induced by climate factors. But really, at the end of the day, the person becoming a migrant or moving is really due to a composite of factors, right? I mean, it's due to the fact of, some economic reason, some social network, some connection and the ability to move. Because I think beyond the sort of climate migrant or climate refugee, then I think the ones who are probably the worst hit are what we call the entrapped people, who don't even have the means to move, who could also be impacted by climate. So what would be their status in a way? So I don't have an answer to you, except to say that I think we are some ways off, especially if one comes down to the causality of it. But that's not to say that climate isn't driving some of the movements, but I'll end.
In terms of the global compacts, the climate-induced displacement is firmly rooted in the global compacts, which are, in terms of migration, was led by the member states. And so again, it's not legally binding, but they're the ones who are coming together and they're going to sign the compact. And with the refugee compact, it's also firmly a part of the refugee compact. There's every intention of UNHCR to include them in terms of the refugee assistance programs, but that also has to be codified and regulated and approved by member states. In terms of proof of climate-induced migration, I mean, from what I know in my region, if you look at Lake Turkana, you can see clearly that it's reducing and reducing and reducing over time. And what I know from presentations is that when you look at the recurrence of drought over decades, there's more frequent. And so I guess there can be climate deniers, and that's a much broader issue. But it's clear to me that environmental factors are inducing displacement and forced displacement. And it's also clear that with the growth bulge, which we keep talking about, there's more. Those natural resources are not growing; they're actually diminishing, and the patterns are changing. And so, with more people coming on board, that it's going to get worse. And so, for me, it's clear.
Again, I try from my perspective. Anytime I hear the words political will, I think that here is a problem that in theory has a solution, but in reality we probably will not solve it. So yes, we know what should be done, let's say legally, and that we should create space for climate change induced migration. They should have legal status. I have seen one argument, it was written in The Economist, that one of the reasons why people are hesitant to give the refugees the status of climate change or climate change induced refugees is that it would worsen the status of other refugees. That was this argument which was new to me, and maybe there is some reasonable statement that it might be true. So yes, we know what should be done, but again, it's very difficult to get it into reality. And I would say there is some hope in that when there will be millions and millions of climate change refugees, they will finally get the status, but probably it will not help them too much.
Well, we heard experts today and yesterday saying that maybe there is time to change the narrative and stop thinking about categories like refugee and forced migrant and take it as a new norm. And I'm wondering whether in your research you also touched upon development, obviously the World Bank, whether there is maybe solution in development. So maybe not thinking about what we are talking about from the point of view of taking care of the people who are forced to migrate, but rather take it as a new norm, as a new challenge, as a new opportunity, and look through development of their countries of origin or our own, with people coming. Is there any chance, any nexus in it?
Susanna, are you talking about in the context of programs in the countries that we work, or with the European context?
More in the context of countries that are affected by climate change, and also then perhaps from the perspective of receiving countries, potentially receiving countries. Maybe not talk about them as refugees who need our assistance and protections, etc., but rather more dignified manner that these are people coming and we can let them live in dignified manner.
So I think what the World Bank is doing is going back about 4 years now, maybe slightly more. We are required by the funds that we get, particularly for the IDA funds, which are the funds we get for the poorest of our countries, to screen every project for climate risks. And this has really forced us to step up our attention to the nature of climate vulnerabilities and risks. And this was required for every investment that we do, to look at how are the people exposed to climate, what are the vulnerabilities, and therefore build in some of the resilience and adaptation measures into the design of that project. And this has now been extended to all of our investments. That means even loans that we do and lending that we do to our middle income countries. So this is really a very concrete step in terms of the way we are mainstreaming climate change. Then I think in terms of the issues of displacement and migration and fragility and conflict and violence, there has been a lot of now, especially in the last round, a big focus on addressing these issues, specifically in fragile conflict and violence-driven countries, but also more in the context of climate migration. So where I think that the bank is coming in is trying to build those diversification of livelihood strategies, building up social safety nets, and in very specific projects, including in their design conversations between the host community and the migrant community. I think that's a really important part of bringing a common understanding and breaking down perceptions or certain ideas that people have of each other. And I think that's an aspect that I've seen that is being pursued much more than before, which I think is something that if you extend it beyond a project or within a country to across countries, it really does make sense, because a lot of our ideas are sometimes driven by perceptions and sort of what we hear in the media or from hearsay. But I think that kind of breaking down of barriers is an important part.
UNHCR has started an initiative called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Frameworks Response Plan. And World Bank is a partner in that. And what it's working to do is to promote the development of host communities and move people outside of camps. And so you have economic growth, which they benefit from each other. In my region, there's over 5 million refugees. There's over 12 million internally displaced people. And you talked earlier about the European context. In the context where I'm living, the African countries have a great burden in providing assistance and hosting displaced populations, and they're responding to it. They're all a part of the refugee response framework, apart from Tanzania at this moment, although many of the tenets of that framework they're abiding by. A piece of good news, I call my region a global epicenter of mobility, because there's so many people who are displaced because of economic reasons or environmental reasons or because of conflict. And within my region, the good news is that 3 of the countries are amongst the fastest growing economies in the world. And when economies are growing quickly, then people tend to stay home more and they develop more and their country's birth rates go down. And so there's hope that for a continuation of this great economic boom. At the same time, there's a lot of concerns and cracks in the system. And I think the epicenters of mobility need, like a Marshall Plan. I think we need to come together and look at all those conflicting issues and focus our developmental frameworks for those areas because there's so much happening. And there was the question before about will there be continued numbers coming abroad and coming to Europe? Well, certainly there's going to be if you're adding so much in terms of population and if you don't have mechanisms in place and you're not addressing some of those root issues.
Do we have more questions before we close? Okay, please.
Hello, my name is Valentina and I'm a student and an environmental activist. Thank you for your time today, and I'd like to ask, from the people's point of view, the magical question of what do you think we can do as citizens, individuals, and ordinary people who wish to fight for climate justice and who wish to fight the capital-led society which represses it. So I would just like to hear your suggestions of what's the best thing. And
I think this would be perfect closing question, so if each of you could have your own take on it.
No, that's of course a very important question, and I think there is no easy answer. If it were an easy answer, we are probably not sitting here. Well, I think the first step would be to know where the consumption comes from, what's the most energy-consuming activity, and what can be changed easily, and then come to the more hard things to change. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows that flying should be the most problematic part of many people who are flying, but these are the people who probably will continue to fly, and those who are not will probably not fly because they are poor. But, I mean, so the first thing is to know what you are doing, what it's causing, and how can you change it. There are tons of materials on the internet where you can find, your carbon footprint, your ecological footprint, whatever. And it's not that difficult to know it. The problem is that people simply, they are not interested. So again, all that reduces your consumption is important, but unless the things are cheap or relatively cheap, the consumption will increase. That is, there will be economic growth, production growth, consumption growth, and so on. And that's, so there is no, individual action is important, but it's not a systemic solution. On the other hand, we cannot differentiate between individual and collective, because what we do individually is reflected in the collective impact, or in the institutions, politicians, and so on. Unless there is significant portion of people demanding change, there will be no change. There are social studies how many people, there are estimations between 10 to 20% is usually enough to induce large scale social change, be it revolution or whatever. That is still not a guarantee of the success. I don't think it will happen unless there are even more serious impacts of climate change. But there is hope that there will be, but I don't know when, and we will see.
This is really environmentally focused, this question. I mean, I feel like from my region, there needs to be a call of arms where people are coming together and saying this is a place where we need to invest, and without investment it's just going to get worse. The number of people in need of humanitarian assistance, so not being able to feed themselves, has grown in my 3 years from about, I think, 12 million to 25 million. And so it just keeps getting worse, and until there's some sort not just reactive measures, but planning measures, then we're going to have a hard time making any changes. And so we have to focus our preemptive activities on livelihoods and education and economic growth and all those things.
There is a wise saying, and I don't know where it comes from, that says that the leaders of a nation are a reflection of the collective consciousness of the population. And I think this is where I think it's for each of us to grasp. I mean, we do two things. We go to, clearly vote, right? That's one way to do change. But I think the more important is, I think, as social agents, I think for us to really think through these issues and put yourself in the shoes of different stakeholders. I thought we did a very good game today at the conference where it was a really role-playing, where, people took on different roles. And, whether you were the EU policymaker or the national policymaker or civil society or the public opinion. And sometimes just putting yourself and really putting yourself, thinking through the issues and debating and talking about it, I think is a really healthy way to change minds and open your mind to different ways of looking at things. And I think that's really important to do so now. And I think in the sort of broader context of where some of the work we've been doing or I've been doing is on the climate side, is really, I think we all can make a change with our own carbon footprint. So I just leave you with those two thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I've been hearing from all three of you, and especially in this last intervention, is basically get more involved, be present, and be involved, be active. And this is precisely why we as IOM also do this type of events. And we are trying to share the knowledge and the wisdom of people who have it with those who are willing to receive it, to listen to it. I don't know, you probably noticed that most of the audience are much younger than us, which is already a hope, because they're interesting and they're future leaders and they're future people who will be elected and who will be voted by us, hopefully. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you spending your late evening and almost night with us and on this topic. And I really thank you very, very much, Kanta, Jeff, and Alexander, for sharing your wisdom with us and spending, again, late night with us. Thank you very much.